Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Officer Warner with Halifax Police Department. Are you aware of why I pulled you over today?
No.
Are you,
no, sir.
Are you familiar with vehicle code 1739? Well, it's actually against the law to drive on a hot day without an ice cream cone. So,
Oh my God, it was that.
on behalf of the Halifax Police Department, we're just making sure that everybody's following all the laws today and are driving with ice cream cones. Like I said, I'm Officer Warner. This is Chief of Police Lance here in Halifax. We just wanted to make sure you guys were in compliance.
Y'all have a wonderful day.
Are you okay?
Oh my God.
In the old, cold northern land of Canada, nothing has established itself as more offensive than accusing someone of any kind of bigotry, especially if you're a minority yourself. The image Canada would like to portray to the world is that of a liberal, open society, largely free of petty squabbles like racism, homophobia, etc. Except, of course, for the very few bad apples who still hold such views, who can be identified only should they stand on top of the nearest mountain peak and scream, "I'm a bigot" 5 times in quick succession, and even then it must be exactly at 12:05 AM, no earlier, no later. This image of tolerance and inclusivity is so central to the cultural identity of Canada that to break this vision, to dispel this mirage, is to destroy all that many Canadians believe about their country, and by extension, themselves. Hello, I'm Satan. I'll be your resident mirage dispellers today. How's the family? Hiding behind Canada's facade, there lies, in fact, quite a conservative country, but not conservative in the regressive sense it's used in the United States, or even in the sense of fiscal conservatism, but in the traditional sense. TLDR, I guess, Canadians don't like change. While Canada's rapid urbanization affects many aspects of its culture, as it did with most modern industrialized countries in the 20th century, Canada's soul has fundamentally been a conservative one. One need only look at its political history. The Liberal Party, that is, the centrist party of Canada, held power for almost 70 years in the 20th century, more than any other party in a developed country. The only thing I can think of to compare it to is the domination of the Liberal Democratic Party in post-war Japan, one of the few developed countries to be more conservative than Canada. That party has lost a majority in Japan only twice, for periods of a few years each, since 1955 in the reformation of the Japanese political system. You might wonder then why Canada is always talked about like progressive utopia. Well, since Canada's brand is America but better, its policies are often seen in the light of the US's policies, which are really something else entirely. Among developed countries, Canada was actually one of the last to implement a universal healthcare system, for example. And of course, when it was implemented, it was through a painfully sluggish decade-long rollout, starting from a trial of the system in Saskatchewan in 1962, by which time similar systems had already been implemented in the UK, New Zealand, Sweden, and many other countries. A similar dynamic existed for many of the social programs like pensions Canada likes to show off today, in that, compared to other developed nations, it was relatively slow to adopt them. And really, beyond those points, the Canadian versions of which are usually lacking when compared to many other developed countries, there isn't much to justify Canada's status as progressive. Public universities are still expensive, dental care isn't covered in the healthcare system, it has a Gini coefficient or inequality index above most developed nations, and the list goes on and on. Canada couldn't even get rid of the monarchy, right? Instead opting to let it hang on without food for a century, wasting away and exposed to the elements until it could finally just shake it off.
Shake it off.
And yes, while Canada does have a relatively open immigration policy, that has more to do with its perpetual labor shortage than anything. Canada simply can't afford to have a restrictive immigration policy. And even regardless of that, Canada in recent times, just as with many other places in the developed world, has seen a shift towards a xenophobic right-wing populism with the likes of Andrew Scheer. No surprise then, but Canada's police force isn't actually a group of nice men handing out ice cream. Like the British and French implementations it was modeled after, Canada's police force was set up as an instrument of colonialism and helped to criminalize all behaviors that fell outside of its hegemonic idea of cultural whiteness. In Toronto, for example, black people are 20 times more likely to be killed by the police than white residents. Nationwide, Indigenous people represent 15% of police fatalities, despite being 5% of the population. In almost every major city, there exists a statistically identifiable targeting of Black and Indigenous people. And of course, that doesn't come from a history of treating these groups well, what with the slavery and genocide and whatnot. What's interesting then is the way that Canada's particular form of racism manifests. Because if Canada's needs to appear progressive, even to its own citizens, the police use several techniques to make themselves look like a neutral organization, most often gaslighting their victims. Gaslighting, for those who don't know, is a form of psychological abuse and manipulation meant to make the victim question their own sanity. In the case of the Canadian police, they avoid making overt references to race as much as possible, so that whenever racial discrimination is suspected, in the absence of any direct evidence implicating any specific officer in a racist action, it becomes easy to accuse Black and Indigenous people of paranoia and a victim complex should we complain. And you know, that's kind of the MO of Canada as a whole, isn't it? I mean, I live in Canada and I can tell you that this behavior isn't exclusive to the police. It's in the whole culture, this inability people of color face to address racism without being portrayed as lunatics. I wouldn't be surprised if there was no conscious effort on the police's part to do this, but if it was just a natural consequence of forming a Canadian police department. People of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, often feel alienated from and distrustful of people from other communities, usually white people, because of the subtle racism and microaggressions that are constantly sent our way, but against which you can't properly fight because of the difficulty in proving racism in any specific person, even though we know it exists on a systemic level. All we have are hunches, and when all we have are hunches, it makes it sound crazy when we accuse someone of bigotry and can't prove it with facts and logic. This behavior exists in all countries living under the boot of white supremacy, but Canada's culture of faux progressivism makes it an especially notable problem here. A majority, 75% in fact, agree that there's a systemic problem with racism in the RCMP, Canada's national police force otherwise known as the Mounties, and no, they don't actually ride horses, but they are the principal instrument in the modern-day genocide of the Wet'suwet'en Nation Native Americans. However, 40%, a majority of those who believe that the RCMP has a problem with systemic racism, somehow believe that the RCMP can fix it themselves, which is fucking delusional since they are literally making no effort to do that. And keep in mind, this poll took place after the George Floyd protests started happening, so this is Canada at its wokest. This polling lays bare the impotent centrist pathos of the Canadian cultural psyche. While the number of 75% might seem high, it might make it seem that Canadians are aware of and concerned with systemic racism. Looking deeper into the polling makes it clear that the number stems from a desire to look progressive rather than to be progressive. Believing the RCMP will fix its own issue with racism is tantamount to believing that there is no racism at all, because the result in either case is that, as always, nothing will be done about the systemic discrimination that plagues Black and Indigenous communities. Only 35% of Canadians actually want to do something about systemic racism and policing, but a whole lot more want to look like they want to do something. And of course that's reflected in the Liberal Party leadership. For all of Justin Trudeau's pandering to marginalized groups, things have remained just as bad for the Black community, and for Indigenous communities especially, Trudeau has been central to an increase in their destruction. So guys, we won't achieve liberation through succumbing to their gaslighting, through just waiting around until they decide to treat us better. We need to get out into the streets, to disrupt their lives every day with protests until they take the bullseye off us, until they finally realize that Black lives matter. Thanks to Questing Refuge, Oreed, Tommy Lobo, and Amalia for sponsoring today's video. If you'd like to have your name read at the end of these videos, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/satenmadpun. You can also make a one-time donation at paypal.me/satenmadpun. I really appreciate your guys' support. Remember to like, subscribe, share the video, ring that notification bell, all that awesome stuff. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks so much again. I love you guys. Bye!